Spying by Telescope, Chapter 1. So you boys want to help me on another case? Benton Hardy, internationally known detective, smiled at his teenage sons. Dad, you said you're working on a very mysterious case right now, Frank spoke up. Isn't there some angle of it that Joe and I could tackle? Mr. Hardy looked out the window of his second-floor study as if searching for the answers somewhere in the town of Bayport where the Hardys lived. Finally, he turned back and gazed steadfastly at his sons. All right. How would you like to look for some smugglers? Joe Hardy's eyes opened wide. You mean it, Dad? Now, just a minute, the detective held up his hand. I didn't say capture them. I said look for them. Even that's a big assignment. Thanks for giving it to us, Frank replied. The lean, athletic detective walked to a corner of the study where a long, narrow carrying case stood. Tapping it, he said, You boys have learned how to manipulate this telescope pretty well. How would you like to take it onto that high promontory above the ocean and train it seaward? The place I mean is 2 miles north of the end of the bay and 8 miles from here. That would be great, said 17-year-old blonde-haired Joe, his blue eyes flashing in anticipation. Frank, who was a year older than his brother and less impetuous, asked in a serious tone of voice, Dad, do you have any ideas about the identity of any of these smugglers? Yes, I do, Mr. Hardy answered his tall, dark-haired son. I strongly suspect that a man named Felix Snapman is operating in this territory. I'll give you the whole story. The detective went on to say that he'd been engaged by an international pharmaceutical company to trace stolen shipments of valuable drugs. Reports of thefts had come from various parts of the United States. Local police had worked on the case, but so far had failed to apprehend any suspects. Headquarters of the firm is in India, the detective told the boys. It was through them that I was finally called in. I'm sure that the thefts are the results of smuggling, and very cleverly done. That's the reason I suspect Snapman. He's a noted criminal and had been mixed up in smuggling rackets before. He served a long term in prison and after being released dropped out of sight. And you think he's working around Bayport? Joe asked. He whistled. That doesn't make this town a very healthy place to live in. But we're going to make it so, Mr. Hardy declared, a ring of severity in his voice. Just where is the spot we're to use the telescope? Frank asked eagerly. It's on the Pollitt place. You'll see the name at the entrance. An old man named Felix Pollitt lived there alone for many years. He was found dead in the house about a month ago, and the place has been vacant ever since. It sounds as if we could get a terrific range up and down the shore from there, many miles across the river, Frank remarked. Mr. Hardy glanced at his wristwatch. It's 1:30 now. You ought to be able to go out there, stay a fair amount of time, and still get home for supper. Oh, easily, Joe answered. Our motorcycles can really burn up the road. His father smiled with caution. This telescope is very valuable. The less jouncing it receives, the better. I get the point, Joe conceded, then asked, Dad, do you want us to keep the information about the smugglers to ourselves, or would it be all right to take a couple of the fellows along? Of course I don't want the news broadcast, Mr. Hardy said, but I know I can trust your special friends. Go ahead and call them up. How about Chet and Biff? Joe consulted Frank. As his brother nodded, he said, You pack the telescope on your motorcycle. I'll phone. Chet Morton was a stout, good-natured boy who loved to eat. Next to that, he enjoyed being with the Hardys and sharing their exciting adventures. Although at times, when situations became dangerous, he wished he were somewhere else. Chet also loved to tinker with machinery and spent long hours on his jalopy, which he called Queen. He was trying to soup up the motor so that he could have a real hot rod. In contrast to Chet, Biff Hooper was tall and lanky. To the amusement and wonder of the other boys, he used his legs almost as a spider does, covering tremendous distances on level ground or vaulting fences. A few minutes later, Joe joined his brother in the garage and told him that both Chet and Biff would go along. Chet, he said, had apologized for being unable to offer Queen for the trip, but her engine was all over the garage. As usual, Frank said with a grin as the two boys climbed on their motorcycles and set out. Presently, the Hardys stopped at Biff Hooper's home. He ran out the door to meet them and climbed aboard behind Joe. Chet lived on a farm at the outskirts of Bayport, about a 15-minute run from the Hooper home. The stout boy had strolled down the lane to the road and was waiting for his friends. He hoisted himself onto Frank's motorcycle. I have never seen a powerful telescope in operation, he remarked. How far away can you see with this thing? It all depends on weather conditions, Frank replied. On a clear day, you can make out human figures at a distance of 24 miles. Wow, Chet exclaimed. We ought to be able to find those smugglers easily. I wouldn't say so, Biff spoke up. Smugglers have the same kind of boats as everybody else. How close do you have to be to identify a person? Oh, about 2.5 miles, Joe answered. The motorcycles chugged along the shore, with Frank watching a speedometer carefully. We ought to be coming up to the Pollitt place soon, he said finally. Keep your eyes open, fellas. The boys rode on in silence, but suddenly they all exclaimed together, "There it is!" At the entrance to a driveway thickly lined with trees and bushes was a stone pillar, into which the name Pollitt had been chiseled. Frank and Joe turned into the driveway. The only part of the house they could see was the top of the roof. Finally, beyond a lawn overgrown with weeds, they came upon the tall, rambling building. It stood like a beacon high above the water. Pounding surf could be heard from far, far below. "This place sure looks neglected," Biff remarked. Dank, tall grass grew beneath the towering trees. Weeds and bushes threatened to engulf the whole building. "Creepy, if you ask me," Chet spoke up. "I don't know why anyone would want to live here." The house itself was in need of repair. Built in wood, it had several sagging shutters, and the paint was flaking badly. Poor Mr. Pollitt was probably too sick to take care of things, Frank commented as he looked at several weed-choked flower beds. To the Hardys' disappointment, the sky had become overcast, and they realized that visibility had been cut down considerably. Nevertheless, Frank unstrapped the carrying case and lugged it around to the front of the house. He unfastened the locks, and Joe helped his brother lift on the telescope and attach the tripod, pulling up the IN section first. Biff and Chet exclaimed in admiration. "Boy, that's really neat," Chet remarked. He and Biff watched in fascination as Frank and Joe began to set up the telescope. First, they unfastened the tape with which the tube and the tripod legs were tied together. Joe turned the 3 legs down and pulled out the extensions to the desired length. Then Frank secured the tripod legs with a chain to keep them from spreading. "Well, what's next?" Biff asked. "To get proper balance for the main telescope tube, we slide it through this trunnion sleeve toward the eye end like this." After doing so, Frank tightened the wing nuts on the tripod lightly. He picked up the balance weight from the carrying case and screwed it to the right side of the telescope tube, about 1/3 the distance from the eyepiece. "This will keep the whole thing from being top-heavy," he pointed out. "And what's this little telescope alongside the big one for?" Chet queried. "A finder," Frank explained. "Actually, it's a small guide telescope and helps the observer sight his big telescope on the object more easily." "It's as clear as mud," Chet remarked with a grin. He squinted through the ends of both the large and small telescopes. "I can't see a thing," he complained. Joe laughed. "And you won't be able to until I insert one of the eyepieces into the adapter of the big telescope and put another eyepiece into the finder." In a few minutes, the Hardys had the fascinating device working. By turning a small knob, Frank slowly swung the telescope from left to right, and each boy took a turn looking out across the water. "Not a boat in sight," said Chet, disappointed. Frank had just taken his second turn squinting through the eyepiece when he called out excitedly, "I see something!" He now began a running account of the scene he had just picked up. "It's not very clear, but I see a boat. It must be at least 6 miles out." "Well, what kind of boat?" Joe put in. "Looks like a cruiser or a cutter. It's not moving. You want to take a look, Joe?" Frank's brother changed places with him. "Say, fellas, a man's going over the side in a ladder, and hey, there's a small boat down below. He's climbing into it." "Can you see a name or numbers on the big boat?" Frank asked excitedly. "No, the boat's turned at a funny angle, so you can't see the lettering. You couldn't even if the weather was clear." Which way is the man in the small boat heading?" Biff asked. "He seems to be going toward Barmet Bay." Joe gave up his position a bit. "Suppose you keep your eye on him for a while, and also the big boat. Maybe it'll turn so you can catch the name or the number of the box." Chet had been silent for several moments. "Now," he said, "do you suppose they're the smugglers?" "Could be," Frank replied. "I think we'd better leave and report this to Dad. From the first telephone He was interrupted by a sudden terrifying scream of a man. "Well, where did that come from?" Chet asked with a frightened look. "Sounds as if it came from inside," Frank answered. "The boys stared at the house on the cliff. A moment later they heard a loud cry for help that was followed by another scream. "Somebody's in there and they're in trouble," Joe exclaimed. "We'd better find out what's going on." Leaving the telescope, the 4 boys ran to the front door and tried the knob. The door was locked. "Let's scatter and see if we can find another door," Frank suggested. Frank and Joe took one side of the house, Biff and Chet the other. They met at the rear of the old home and together tried a door there. This, too, was locked. "There's a broken window around the corner," Biff announced. "Shall we climb in?" "I guess we'd better," Frank answered. As the boys reached the window, which seemed to open into a library, they heard the scream again. "Help! Hurry! Help!" came an agonized cry. And that is the end of Chapter 1.